First, rather than just talk about writing, I'm going to ask you all to do a little bit of writing here. Just jotting down some responses to some prompts that I'm going to give you, 3 short prompts. And then we'll have you discuss your answers in groups of about 3, right? Or at your table if you have, 4. And then from your table decide on something to share with the whole room, with the whole class, I should say. Okay. So writing prompts. First one, identify and briefly describe some research assignment that you give. And maybe especially one that hasn't quite worked as well as you hoped it would. And we can sort of workshop that a little bit. But yeah, so identify one research assignment you give in one of your classes. It can be anything, but should have a sort of outside research component. So jot that down. And once you have that, the second prompt is, what's the single most important thing you hope your students gain from this assignment? Okay, so what's the objective? What do you hope students will gain from completing this assignment? There are probably many things, but choose maybe the most critical objective. So which group will start? What's one goal that you have for your research assignment? I think Mendel wants to start. From your group, what's just one goal? Out of the 3 assignments that you shared, what's one goal that you have for a research assignment?
Is this one goal we all had in common, you're saying?
Well, or just, no, it doesn't have to be in common.
We want them to learn things by doing stuff.
That's right.
And how do you know students are learning things?
I was just teasing. Something that came up more than once was we want them to work a little harder than just taking the first 3 hits that you get on Google with yourself. Actually, it's not about working harder, it's just about being more discriminating than that.
Yeah. Giving them that experience of becoming part of a scholarly community, looking for ideas. The method of evaluation, one of the things that I'm looking for is to see if there is a charitable representation of the author's core argument. In the case of my field, that often means that the students are looking at argumentative essays. So students often misunderstand the central argument in the piece, or they pick up on something that was really a tangent and not the central argument in the piece, or they take a portion of the essay that wasn't even argumentative at all and somehow understand it to be an argument, and so it's wrestling with those sorts of issues and evaluating their writing from that point of view. That's the approach.
And how do you know whether they've represented the source accurately?
Often it means I've got to go track down that source and read it myself.
Already.
Sometimes they cite papers that are well known enough that I'm familiar with the main names in that article. Sometimes it means that I have to, if it's interesting enough, I'll have to track it down. And other times it means that if I'm familiar with that author that they're citing, then I might know of their general sort of research program, and so I can sort of tell if they're.
That author wouldn't say that or whatever.
What's it? Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, right.
We're working a little bit backwards from you. So both of us, we were thinking about relevance of the source before we get to the argument of that specific source. So that's, one of the things. One of our goals, of course, is to have the students search for an article or view. And first of all, is how relevant is it to your topic? So that we make sure that's goal. And then how do we assess that? Is that how do they justify in using, in John's case? In my case, it's an LSFI 102, like one source paper. So I'm looking for how do they use it as evidence. Yeah, so according to how well they're able to use it to support their argument, which of course source asks for what you said, that they need to read through and understand the basic argument.
So is it fair to say the onus is on the student to justify
Yes.
the relevance of the source?
Relevance of the source. And of course for me, I don't know, John, you can add to it, I do a single worksheet where they have to write answers to questions.
Okay.
Like what is the main argument, how do you know, what are the evidences? So that's pre to their paper.
Okay.
The field of drugs and behavior, and then they have to write 2 arguments for and 2 arguments against and support them with primary literature. And so the main goal, again, is along those lines of, can you use primary sources to support an argument? And I simply just evaluate that by, is it a primary source? And in my case, that's hard enough. So that's really how I evaluate their sources. Are they using the actual data collected by the researchers that wrote the paper? Kristen has a similar or a different kind of assignment where they're using other sources besides the scientific primary journal articles, and then she has a hard time figuring out sometimes outside of our field what's a primary source and what isn't. So that's an interesting thing for us to think about. I kind of do the same because sometimes they bring in stuff from economics and things like that. And it's sort of like, yeah. If they didn't do an experiment, what's the primary source? So we have a little trouble with that.
So the assignment is just to teach the distinction between primary and secondary
Yeah.
sources. So cases.
Finding things that are relevant to the topic and integrating those sources well into their arguments. And those all relate pretty directly to some of the observations that we wanted to share. First of all, I'm going to start with actually a broader study, nothing Augustana specific. It's a study done by the Citation Project, which some of you may have heard of. And this project is designed specifically to look at the way students use sources in their papers. And I have some numbers here from a preliminary study that they did of first-year composition papers, okay, and the way that students use sources in those papers. On the surface, it sounds, pretty straightforward. 42% of the citations that they analyzed were direct quotes from sources. 32% were paraphrases. 16% were patch written, which means that the student tried to paraphrase the source, but stayed too close to the original passage. So either they used too much of the original language, or they stayed too close to the original structure of the passage, or some of both. 6% were summaries. In some ways, that doesn't sound too horrible. But when you think about it, 6% were summaries. That means that everything that wasn't a summary is engaging with the sources at the sentence level, meaning they take a sentence out of the argument. That may or may not represent what the author is actually arguing. And it may or may not indicate that the students understand the argument as a whole. So you don't know necessarily. Further evidence suggesting that students in their study were engaging with sources at the sentence level. Or not, I should say, not engaging with overall arguments, more specifically. If 46% of the citations were to the first page of the source. 70%, 70, were to the first 2 pages. So this is what they found. Again, this is first-year compositions. So what have we seen looking at library prize papers? It came up that it's really difficult to track down the sources that students use. Not always difficult necessarily, but extremely time-consuming. And we have found that as judges for the library prize too. So we can't say that we have, sat down with years' worth of library prize papers and looked at all of them, because that would take us forever. But last summer, we ended up scrutinizing some of the papers really carefully, because we thought, this is a prize for first-year research. So we want to see how the papers are using their sources. It made sense. So sort of, a smaller number of papers that kind of were starting to float to the top a little bit in terms of the ones that we had read. And we've made some similar observations from previous years. So I'm not trying to point the finger at this particular class. But this is just sort of the most recent observations that we made. And we start actually tracking down the sources and looking at their arguments, the pages that the students cite, and so on. we see, again, we don't have numbers here, but we see the patch writing, it comes up. So again, that's trying to paraphrase but not getting it quite right. Paraphrases that misinterpret or misunderstand the original passage. Quote mining, where students take, where there's a quote taken from the original passage that's taken out of context potentially. Citations that don't necessarily point correctly to the source. So there will be a page number, you go to that page, you can't find the quote, or you're not quite sure where the idea came from that was paraphrased in the sentence. Misattributing ideas, like citing two authors, getting them mixed up later on in the paper, so suddenly, you know, Jones is saying this and Smith is saying that, even though they didn't originally, they're sort of flipped around. Making bad decisions sometimes about when to quote and when to paraphrase, or sometimes even not knowing when to cite, like only citing direct quotes, for example. Right? The last two are a little bit more technical in nature, but some of these are really suggesting that, you know, our students too are doing some of the things that the Citation Project found in their study. And I think what's noteworthy about this is that these are some of the best papers that have been written all year. And we see it in LSFY papers and in honors papers. And I'm not saying this to criticize our students. I'm saying this because, I mean, they're first year students. We can't expect them to be perfect. And some of these papers are really, really smart and well written. But if our very best students have these problems, you know, what's going on overall? And we thought, you know, maybe people don't know necessarily because nobody has the time to take 25 papers that have been written for a class and track down all of the sources from every single paper to find out what's going on. So we just thought that was something that's sort of worth communicating and thinking about. Just as a way of letting everybody know that, yeah, this is something that all our students are struggling with because it's really, really hard. And let's think about some ways that we can teach it a little bit better, possibly, so that you know, we run into less or fewer issues along these lines. So,
issues, as Stephanie just mentioned, and I find that a lot of it boils down to difficulty reading. The students say, I have to go and find 5 scholarly articles. Well, I found them. I found the first 5 that came up, probably. And find that the quote mining happens because they read through a page and they don't know how to read that genre, and they don't have explicit instruction in reading, so they pull out the first sentence that they understand. Blammo, there's a quotation, right? No matter what the relevance, no matter if it encapsulates the author's actual argument, there's a quotation. I got it, I'm good, right? And I point blank asked my LSFY students, I shared some of, not the library prize, but the Citation Project's findings that Stephanie mentioned about the first page of the source, the first 2 pages, and I said, what do you think? Are you surprised? No, they weren't surprised. They thought it was about right. Well, why? I said, well, why is this the case? And they said, you know, we just don't have time. We don't have time in a 10-week term to find this many sources and do you know, this much work with each source and you know, make sure that everything, and some said, well, maybe we have time, but we're lazy, right? So, I don't know, but those were 2 hypotheses offered from my students. But I'd like to ask our peer tutors to say some things that they've noticed about. You know, we're on one side of kind of the student-faculty divide, they're on another, and so I think students talk more freely to peer tutors, and so I've asked each of them, you know, go ahead and introduce yourselves and also share one thing that you would want our faculty to know about.
You're a senior English education major here, and something that I've noticed is that writers tend to let their sources sort of run their essay in a sense, where it's not really them coming up with their own idea, but it's more like, well, I really agree with this guy and this writer. And I think part of that from talking with them is that they don't always feel comfortable disagreeing with an expert of the discipline. So I'm not really sure how to go about making them feel more comfortable with disagreeing with someone who's so much more well-informed with them. But I'd say that's a big thing, just getting them comfortable with putting their own ideas out there. And that's all I have to say for right now. Thank you.
I'm Michael McRae. I'm a senior computer science major. And something that I've noticed a lot, it has to do with like the relevance of sources. Like that's a common issue, and I think that is connected to kind of like defining the topic. Often for students is a challenge in itself, like figuring out the scope of the topic, and like well, I guess that's it. Just figuring out like how convincing, like how specific does it need to be, and then what is it going to involve? Like if it's about a book, am I going to be able to use movie sources about that, or does it make sense to talk about this other author too, and things like that.
Two things I would say are really important when you're going to assign a research paper. Tell your students how many sources you want. People always want to know how many sources minimum. I know it's kind of like, well, you should use as many as you feel are necessary, but students really just want to know the number, at least, they just need to know that benchmark. Another thing too, even though they're kind of annoying, annotated bibliographies are really helpful, especially if you want to get students to read past that first or second page, because the annotated bibliography will have them do a small summary, and then the most important part of that is how are you going to use this argument in your paper. So if you don't yet assign an annotated bibliography, your students might hate you for it, but eventually I think it'll be the most helpful thing for them.
I'm a mathematics and secondary education major, and the biggest thing that I've noticed about student writing, and it's been most helpful to me and to the students that I work with, is some sort of outlining of the assignment before the assignment is due. And this is really important with what Lucas was mentioning about managing time. A lot of times students read their sources and write their paper in the same sitting, which is not something that students are very capable of doing well. And related to that, I know a lot of teachers here in research assignments do assign some sort of planning project, but a lot of the students have expressed to me concern about needing to do it in a specific format. And so when offering students that opportunity to plan things ahead of time, it would be really helpful to have multiple ways to do it. So a lot of students are visual learners, or they want to see it like written out in like an outline format. And so allowing that flexibility when planning this is really helpful to a lot of the students.
Conversation, right? So let's have some more conversation, and especially if you have questions of the peer tutors, if you want to know more about kind of what we can expect from students at different points and how students go about these things, please let's just spend some time talking.
Students tailoring their papers to what the critics are saying. One thing that I try to do to let them be aware that the paper is their paper, and what they are trying to express is the most important thing, and that whatever else they add to it is auxiliary and supporting. And the other thing is that they do not necessarily have to agree with that source, and they do not also necessarily have to entirely disagree with the source, that they can observe the source and see if some aspect of it they agree with it, in some aspects they don't agree, because there is always this feeling that they either have to go along with it or not go along with it. And then finally I say, this is actually a chance to assert your authority. I say, if you are able to disprove or to challenge a top professor from Princeton or Harvard and say, this renowned scholar says this, but I think this way because. And that's where again the justification comes in. And you give, especially if you're analyzing a text or a context, a situation, because, and then you give your proof, and if your proof is strong or valid enough, just feel empowered to do that and not coward-like, because this is such a well-known person. So for them to know that they have the authority, the flexibility to use this for what they want to do.
And I'm noticing that this is more and more becoming the way students write. They have these patches, and then they kind of smooth over the patches, kind of make it their own. If they forget to do that, that becomes plagiarism. So we can't, or I can't, really control how students, when they go home and they're writing their paper, what the method is, using a notebook, taking notes from what they read. I give them the assignment unless it becomes very kind of leveled and structured. The only thing that comes to my mind as a solution, which isn't a great one, because of its limits, is like timed writing. Because the students have to read in advance and they come sit down, there's nothing in front of them. But you can't do that much with that, and you can't do a research paper, you know. So it's a problem. I don't know if there are ideas how to change the way students sit down to write a paper, but it's something that I noticed.
Copy paste, copy paste. I was gonna go back and cite that, but I just missed it. How did it get there then? So yeah, I've been wondering the same question, like what is the process? How do students write?
I say it's causing some problems. The emphasis is on what's around the quotation and not what the quotation itself says and how that advances the argument. That, you know, there's more attention to what surrounds the evidence and the research than what actually is happening in the process.
This is probably not an ideal solution if we're talking about genuine research, but for something that's maybe an LSFY solution to that might be to have an assignment prompt, and you've chosen the sources. So you've said these are the sources, these are what you're going to use in this, so that you as an instructor then can get deeply familiar with those sources. And then you can simply work on integration. Now, that assignment sounds terrible in one sense because there's no choice. You know, I mean, it's incredibly limiting. But at least if we're just talking about the moves of how you integrate, maybe that might be the way to do it. And I would guess, just thinking outside the box, there would be zero plagiarism because you've said you can't go past these certain limitations, especially if it was a pretty unique assignment prompt. You know, you were asking for certain features of that. That's just a thought. I don't know, you know.
And which reminds us that what we're asking students to do, even at the freshman year level, is really hard. To know that whole They Say I Say book, probably to learn all those moves took me 15 years probably. And we're trying to teach them the whole thing in 1 year. And which reminds me, I have all my undergraduate papers down in the basement, and I read them 5 or 6 years ago, and I did what's your name?
Chase.
Yeah, I did what Chase said in my senior papers. They're all summarizing the work of other historians and saying, I agree with that. And that was enough to get me a 3.9 GPA and 5 beta kappa at the University of Texas. So we're expecting a hell of a lot, right? And we're having some successes, but a lot of failures too. Let's just keep in mind how complicated this is. And the only answer to that complication, I think, is ever more sophisticated course designs that these research assignments fit into. Because by themselves, they're always going to misfire.
Some of them, I mean, I know from my own experience, I had never done a research paper before coming to college. And if I had, it had been, I was okay to use Google and I was okay to not cite. And so coming into LSFY, though I knew how to write a paper, was really difficult to be told the first paper has to be done in MLA citation. Because right off the bat, I didn't know the citation style. And that, I felt, set me up for failure in the first paper. And so I think keeping that in mind, that it's really difficult for students, and perhaps like the ed major in me is screaming pre-assessment. But because I know that we do writing samples when we come into LSFY, but perhaps in that asking, like on a scale from 1 to 5, how often did you do research papers your senior year? Or what citation styles have you used? And just being able to get that information from your students, because I know like it would have helped me to know that my teacher knew that I didn't know what MLA was before coming in. And keeping that in mind for students, because you might get a class that totally knows it. And so you don't need to spend as much meticulous time on that. But you may get a class that also doesn't know it at all. And so just kind of gauging that would be really helpful as a student.
And high school writing is so different, you know, even for, you know, advanced classes, it's so different than even first-year college writing at most or many schools, that it really is worth remembering sort of where people are coming in from and working from there. I mean, it's tremendous. I've been surprised at how big the gap is, really.
Also, high school reading, can't pick out an argument. Right. 90% of our students have never read an argumentative piece. It's all textbooks,
right,
where every sentence is equally important,
right,
or fiction.
Right.
We can get our students ready for the research paper by assigning something else like an annotated bibliography or something like that, some sort of steps up toward it, like some of us have been saying. It sounds like that's a better way to set students up.
And I would suggest with the annotated bibliography to try to take the thing of like all your 8 sources in an annotated bibliography at once, because then you can kind of gauge where they are by looking sort of source by source rather than looking at them all when it's kind of maybe too late because they've already got their sources, but it's too close to write the paper to go back and try to understand them.
That is, because I've tried lots of different, getting the students up to speed kind of arguments or assignments. And the annotated bibliographies I've had really mixed experiences with because they replicate the abstract so often. I mean, even if they do a good job of replicating the abstract, it's still just like, here's the abstract to the article. And the more interesting part is the part that gets much less attention. How are you going to use it? And so I'm wondering if anybody's been able to do that well in a way that I have sort of by luck done, but never in any kind of systematic way.
Yeah, I did it for LSFI 103. I've been teaching LSFI 103 this will be the 6th time. Last year, they think that annotated bibliography is an assignment by itself. So they just get the grades for that and they're done. So linking the annotated, I tell them that this is your sort of pre-work to your paper to understand argument and all of it. But still, the final paper, it was a disaster. I just couldn't pull the threads together by the end of the 10th week. And I noticed from my own reflection is that we have to teach annotated bibliography as well. There are styles of writing annotated bibliography. You just can't tell them. So a class period is going to take to write how to write an annotated bibliography. And then they have to remember. I mean, that's what my experience with LSFY. Yeah. So teaching.
But I find too that giving students maybe 2 or 3 different annotated bibliographies to show kind of different moves, and maybe the writer in the example, whether you come up with it, or someone else does, maybe you can have the writer say, this source looks useful, but I'm not quite sure how to use it. That's okay too. Instead of just saying, I will absolutely use it this way, I promise it's going to be great. Because oftentimes I find things change, between the annotated bibliography and the final. Something I have not done yet myself, but I'm thinking might be good, is a couple different annotated bibliographies. So maybe one early on and then a week or 2 later, a second one to kind of revise it. I'm thinking that might be helpful, but I haven't done it yet, so. Yeah.
And one of the things that I've started doing, and I'm going to try this time, I did something that was on a much smaller scale, but I'm going to try, I'm teaching 103 this time, which I think is a good time to introduce this kind of idea is, tell me about this group of sources and how you're going to use them. So here's a set of sources that you use for this reason. What's in them? How do you use them in that way? I'm hopeful that it might get them to do the same kind of work, but maybe they're already starting to synthesize them together a little bit.
An assignment that I use with LSFY, but also with the senior seminar students. And it's called the I Wonder assignment. I give it at the point where you would do an annotated bibliography. It's basically that master template, and they say, I say, blown up. And so they are, now that I think about it, it is an annotated bibliography. They're summarizing books, but they are shown in relationship to each other using the they say, I say template. When the subject is blank, so-and-so says, then they have to summarize that meeting or person. And then they have to present 2 or 3 alternate voices. And then they have to step back and suggest where they think they might be going with this, and then naysayers, and the whole template. So that's 15 sources summarized. That's an annotated bibliography, isn't it? Only it doesn't look like it because it's gone meta.
Think about the right thing at the right time kind of approaches, but when I was teaching honors, it took me 10 weeks to convince them that knowledge was something that was developed. It's sort of, and research about the developmental psychology and epistemologies of 18-year-olds say that they believe that knowledge comes from authority and is absolute. And it occurred to me if I wasn't addressing that belief about knowledge, that I couldn't get them to say anything, let alone tell whether something was being said of their own in their writing. And the whole course was about the nature of knowledge. And then at the end, and they were the honor students, and at the end, I kind of got a glimmer that some of them could tell if they had said something of their own or not. And I just want to encourage us to think about what they believe about truth is at play with this issue.
That position they have.
Huh?
Their position on knowledge. What exactly is it that they...
They're dualists. I think they think everything is true or false. So a source is either I agree with it or I disagree with it, it's right or wrong, and everything comes from authority, not like how could he really mean I'm supposed to say something here, because I'm not an authority, so why would I say anything in the paper? That was at play behind the scenes.
Get in the way of that. In the Rainier Area Center, I've noticed a lot that people, that especially first-year students, don't often notice the difference between they say and I say. It's being that I say can be, yes, what you personally think, but you're also using other sources to support what you think. So it's maybe agreeing with one person but disagreeing with another person, or agreeing with certain points of one person but disagreeing with other points. I think that they get very confused between anything that's they is what anybody else has ever said about it. But I can also be the they, and I think that kind of gets in the way of things. So I don't really know if there's a way around that, but just reminding students that they say I say doesn't necessarily mean that it's you against all of them. Like, they can support you.
I find it, and I know that students I've talked to find it really beneficial when instructors really focus on the different readings as like arguments, not just like a book or like text, but an argument, something that is trying to be like communicated with reasons and like with conclusions and things like that, and then kind of like helping the students lay out that argument that seems to be there as a kind of practice. A lot of people do that.
So, Michael, are you talking about kind of when you read course text or an article, when instructors actually make the parts of the argument explicit? Say,
Yeah.
oh, here's where they're doing the counter move. Here's where they're.
Yeah,
kind of?
I think that would be helpful, because I think they, even though that is very, like, the instructors are kind of like spoon feeding that that argument by identifying it in that moment. I think it's really helpful still for them to even be able, they have to have that at least to be able to start doing it on their own.
Alice Horning, the reading expert that was here, said it's everybody's responsibility to teach reading, right? It's not just first term or just reading writing center. We all have to be invested in teaching reading and teaching how to read this specific genre or a logical argument or literature, right? So, or a psych study, right? Like, don't get bogged down in the methodology, right? Go to the real. So there are different ways of reading each of these different genres. So I think a lot of it boils down to explicit instruction in reading.
April 5th on Saturday is our, please state the proper name, Stefanie, of our workshop.
New Directions and Information Fluency. And Sandra Jamison from the Citation Project is one of the principal researchers who found the numbers I was giving you earlier about the percentage of citations that were quotes versus patch writing, how much came from the first page and the second page and so on. That's the project that's doing that. She's going to be doing the Friday Conversation on April 4th, and she's giving the keynote at our conference bright and early at 8:30 a.m. on April 5th, which is a Saturday. So if you're interested in this, try to make it to one of those, because she should be really interesting.